Hello there. I'm Dr. Autumn, leadership consultant, wellness coach, author, and I'm incredibly grateful to be your host of the Aligned Living podcast. I'm here to equip you with the tools, inspiration, and practical tips necessary to lead a life of wholeness and pursue greater shalom in your life and that of your families, teams, and communities. My mission is to empower you to lead from a place of holistic well-being. It's time to say peace out to the fatigue, fog, and frustration of living in a place that lacks abundant well-being. Join me as we embark on a comprehensive exploration of spiritual, physical, mental, emotional, social, and economic well-being, all within the comforting embrace of one podcast. Hey, good people, Dr. Autumn here, and welcome back to the Aligned Living podcast. I'm just so excited to have the opportunity to chat with you today about avoiding or overcoming plateaus, specifically spiritual plateaus. Although it applies to every area of our life. So you'll hear a little bit about physical plateaus and just the frustration around this idea in general. What about plateaus? Well, we all hate them, but we all face them. So today we're going to talk more specifically about how we can implement practices to help us work through the plateaus that keep us stuck so that we can live out of a place of overflow or abundance and avoid spiritual complacency, okay? So all the years I was a personal trainer and or a nutrition coach, there was a phrase I would hear that caused just so much frustration. People would say, Autumn, I think I've hit a plateau. So why so much frustration around this? Well, people would stop moving forward and didn't know why. If you're not familiar with this term, hitting a plateau just means that you are making a change and then you're seeing results from that change, but then the results stop even though you're doing the same thing, right? Like you flatten out, right? You start doing something, you're seeing change, you're going uphill, but then you just flatten out. That's the plateau. And what causes a plateau particularly, let's talk about physical health for a minute as a perfect analogy for spiritual health and avoiding a plateau in that area of our life. So your body stops changing if you stop challenging it. That's what happens with a physical plateau. Let's say you're working out or trying to eat better. And why does this happen? Like in a nutshell, if the work becomes too routine, it can just become a task to check off a list without intention, right? If you keep doing the same thing without being willing to face the challenge required for that change that you desire, you'll stay in the same place. Hence, the plateau, right? But you might ask the question, like, what I was doing was working. Like, I don't get it. Well, sure, because at first it was a challenge for you, but then you grew, you hit some of those initial goals, but without continued change to keep challenging you, you will keep plateauing. Now, there's this beauty in resistance when we embrace it well, right? Like when you hear the word resistance, it might be an initial like turn off, like, oh, or maybe negative associations. But the reality is there's so much beauty that could be found in resistance. The key is how we embrace it, our perspective around it, right? So this is the whole idea behind resistance training or strength training, right? It's how our bodies become more fit and how we get more in shape, or it's how our muscles change, right? When they face resistance of different types, right? Like you could have heavier weight under slow and, longer motions, or you could do endurance training where you're doing lesser weight, maybe quicker, more explosive reps. Like it's all resistance training. That variety is what helps us change, right? As we're challenging our body in new ways. Well, the same goes for our mindset. The same goes for our social wealth or our spiritual formation or our economic well-being, right? We need to face some sort of challenge or resistance in order to grow through it and become better. So while challenge ignites change, plateaus extinguish progress. All right, now this might seem obvious, but so many times we get complacent and comfortable just chilling out on that plateau, on that flat surface. And so I want to kind of push you through this so that you can live in a place of overflow and not spiritual complacency, okay? So, our spiritual formation should never be a task that we drudgingly get through or that we hurry through in order to say, check, done, finished. You know, the process of engaging with God to keep our cup overflowing should be a joy. It should be igniting change. But just too often, we are doing the task all comfy, like laid out flat on the top of that plateau, not moving anywhere. And then we get frustrated when we don't see progress. When, after some time of doing the things you feel like you are doing, you're in the same place. You're stuck, right? Like you're doing the things you think you should do, and then after a while you're like, I'm still in this same place, okay? But why? You are taking strides, right? You're doing the things you're supposed to do, but you're not actually making strides. You see the difference there? You might be taking strides, but you're not making strides. You're like moving your legs, but you're staying in the same place versus actually moving forward. You're not in motion. You're not going anywhere, right? Like this is the mindset. This is the shift we need. This is the difference between doing something just to do it versus being super intentional about it. What is the goal that you want to get out of? And the reason I use that hurried example, because many times we default to doing the thing just to do it because we're too hurried. We're not slowing down to saying, like, what is my goal behind this action right now? Am I making progress towards the person that I want to be? Okay. So we're taking strides, not making strides. And that's the difference. So on this flat plateau, this top that we're just chilling at, we're walking in place, right? When you could be on a mountaintop. Okay. Just think about that for a minute. So, to get to that mountaintop and avoid a plateau or avoid spiritual complacency or to live out of overflow, that's what I like to think about. You have to make your motion count, okay? There's so much to be said there. Make your motion count, make your choices count, be intentional, all right? So, that's what we're going to focus on here, making your motion count. So, let me ask you this. What does spiritual plateau look like and why do you think it happens? All right. So, physical plateau, we just talked about, right? You might make some initial fitness changes or nutrition changes, and you're doing the thing, you're seeing some changes, but then you hit a plateau because you keep doing the same thing over and over. You need variety, you need change, right? So, what does this look like as it relates to spiritual formation? I was reading a book by Mark Batterson, the 40-Day Prayer Challenge from the Draw the Circle series. And each day has a particular takeaway. But on day 29, I was like, this is exactly what I'm talking about. It says, if you want God to do something new, you cannot keep doing the same old thing. All right, this is what we're talking about here. Just as in physical fitness, if you're only walking on a treadmill, you may need to add in some strength training or add in some agility and mobility work if you want longevity. Maybe you're limiting your animal protein intake, but now you need to focus on more nutritional intake and variety, such as getting more veggies or hydrating more, okay? You can't keep doing the same thing and expect growing results. So back to day 29 was titled A New Song, based on Psalm 1, which says, sing to the Lord a new song. Like how many times have we read that and we're like, okay, that's cool, but what does it really mean? So Batterson writes, and I like what he says about this, that spiritual growth is this conundrum. The key to spiritual growth is developing healthy and holy routines called spiritual disciplines, right? Now, we know these are important. The spiritual disciplines are super important, right? But he goes on, and this is exactly what I'm talking about here. But once the routine becomes routine, we need to change the routine. Why? Because sacred routines become empty rituals if we do them out of left brain memory instead of right brain imagination. I love that. So when I am in coaching mode, when it's Coach Autumn instead of Dr. Autumn, I ask the client, what do you want to get out of this? I think with our spiritual well being and our relationship with God, we need to stop to ask ourselves, what do I want to get out of this? And be reminded, what is the purpose behind those spiritual disciplines? It's not, in any case, just a checklist, but we would all agree to that, right? But too often, it becomes exactly like that, a checklist. We rush through the day, knock out the quote unquote task, and then feel good about it and move on. But what did you get out of it? Like, that's the question here. So, going to the gym or working out, for example, it cannot become just a task to check off on your journey to wellness because it won't last. You'll feel depleted because results will stop, and you won't, in the end, be doing your body that much good. Now, don't get me wrong. Like, one of my soapboxes is something is better than nothing. Like, you don't want to get caught up in this all or nothing mindset. But for here, the purpose here is if you're going to take the time to do it, you might as well be intentional about asking yourself, what do I want to get out of this so you can use that time better? If you're taking the time to do the thing and you have a goal, don't you want to make the most of it, right? So, same thing with our relationship with God. I would imagine that none of us wants to become spiritually complacent. Well, if you don't, then you have to be proactive about it, right? So let's look at living out of an overflow. What does that even mean? No matter your circumstances, you're able to walk in the fruits of the Spirit. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. But you're able to have joy in the midst of any emotion, including anger or sadness. Imagine having lots of this spiritual energy. Loneliness isn't a thing because wherever you are, you're connected to God. You experience holy wisdom and discernment because you're in sync with God. When you're tempted, you choose to do the right thing. Now that is overflow. But how do you go about living in that space? Well, you can't live in that space if you become complacent with your spiritual disciplines. Like, that's just facts. Another analogy for you, and this will really drive this point home, and I think it'll be something you'll remember. So, a nutritional profile of what we need to be healthy is our lean protein. I like to say lean, clean protein, lots of veggies, a variety, our healthy fats, and our complex carbs, all right? All nutrient dense foods, but you need variety, right? And you need probiotics and soluble fiber and water, etc., to have a healthy gut, to properly even absorb what you're taking in. Plus, a healthy gut has a lot to do with other aspects of our overall wellness. Okay, so these are foundational to what we need nutritionally. Well, what if you ate the exact same thing every day or your microbiome was unhealthy? In spiritual formation, our healthy gut is our heart's posture before God. Like, what's your intention when you go into those spiritual disciplines? If it's a deep, authentic relationship with God, then the spiritual disciplines you partake in will absorb differently, right? Makes sense? Additionally, to complete the analogy, like, you must switch up your intake. You can't consume the same thing every day. As with spiritual disciplines, there are just some things that we know we must do. But when you go into it with the right heart posture, with the right intention, you know what you want to get out of it, it will change how you do what you do. And it'll really push you and prompt you to integrate variety and not get too caught up in routine. Remember before, like, if the routine becomes too routine, change the routine. So some of the spiritual disciplines I just want to touch on just to give you a little bit like more tangible, like, things to hold on to. So, okay, spiritual discipline, be in the Bible, read the Bible. So how you can approach this, you can read it, you can meditate on it. You can pray through it. If you've never done that, it's a very cool process. You can study it, like, to dig deeper into the context and what it was intended to show us. You can memorize it so that when you need it, it comes to your reminder. It comes to your memory. I remember I was in a season where I was like, man, I'm just trusting God. I'm trusting God. I held on to, in this time of struggle, like, I just held on to these scriptures that I had memorized about trusting God. That's why we memorize. And then you could speak. You could speak the Bible, speak it into existence, speak declarations, speak it over your life, the life of others. All right. So many different ways to be in the Bible. Okay, another spiritual discipline, be in prayer. prayer. It's just talking to God, but you have meditative prayer, listening, where you're just sitting with and being still and listening for God's voice, reflective prayer, and intercessory prayer. There's so many types of prayer, right? Like, this podcast isn't to tell you all the different ways to do these spiritual disciplines. It's to just demonstrate the importance of variety and the importance of not getting caught up in complacency or routines, but really asking God, like, what do I want to get out of this time reading my Bible? What do I want to get out of this prayer time? And then being intentional about it. Okay, another spiritual discipline is worship. All right. This is not just reserved for Sunday mornings. Let me tell you, you could be dancing in the kitchen to worship music while you're preparing dinner. You could be singing in the car with your kids. You could dig in alone at night in your room, wrestling with life and with God. Yet in those moments, we could praise and we can lament and we can worship, right? These are all different types of release and growth. And let me tell you, when I'm coming up with these examples, these are things I personally do. I love listening to worship music in the kitchen while I'm cooking and with my kids in my car, but my nighttime worship time with God before I go to bed, that time that I protect, is some of my favorite time of my entire day. And mind you, I'm an extrovert, so I love being with people, but this time with God is so special, and I am super intentional what I want to get out of it. All right. Not to make light of corporate worship. I mean, that's a really important and significant thing, but I'm just giving you some different types. This is the variety, right? Nutritionally, different types of vegetables, different types of things we take in. This is different types of spiritual disciplines. And then, of course, serving. Serving's a really important one we often neglect. This just supports our calling to, as we love God, to love our neighbors, right? When we place ourselves in position to love our neighbors in new ways, we grow in our faith in new ways, we draw closer to God in new ways. It all helps us to see God in different ways, all right? And there's lots of variety, different ways you could serve, right? And then community is a spiritual discipline, right? Like, we want to be around different people to listen to different voices, right? We all have different gifts and different anointings. We can grow from one another. But mind you, with all those different voices, and I could speak to this personally, we need to let the Holy Spirit be your guide, right? Take things in, but pray through it and consider what you're taking to heart. So take things in with the Spirit of God as your filter. I love thinking about it that way. Just pray for guidance and protection and wisdom, right? Like, it's just be normal part of our rhythms. So that's what it means to switch up your intake. All right. So the question is, what is your goal? If you want overflow, if that's a goal, I don't want spiritual complacency. I want to live out of an overflow. It can't just be a task. It has to be done with intention. So what do you want to get out of it? That's my question. So for example, my goal is not to remain comfortable. It is to grow. Therefore, if my goal is to grow, I have to be challenged, right? Like, just doing the things without being challenged, you're not going to grow in the same way. You have to learn new things. You have to take different forms of action. Well, what kind of action? Like, that's where prayer and time with God comes in. Action in obedience. Well, what can that be, you might ask? That's the relationship piece of all of this. In spiritual formation, that relationship piece is so critical with God, with one another. That is how we begin to discern what those things are for your life, right? Quite frankly. So one thing I do know is that if you're living out of overflow, you can do things in obedience more easily, in love with a gracious spirit, not easily offended, standing for justice and righteousness. This is the fruit of our spiritual growth that I will expand upon in a minute as we wrap up. But that's kind of like, to me, a litmus test of, are your spiritual disciplines productive? Like, are you doing it with intention? Are you growing through them? Are you challenging yourself in ways that can be uncomfortable, right? Like, fruitful and beautiful and fulfilling, yes, excuse me, but potentially a little uncomfortable. So first, how do you get to the overflow and avoid this spiritual plateau? So I found that in my season of stress and struggle, I had to do the daily routines of staying connected to God, whether I felt like it or not, right? Like, I was super intentional about what I wanted to get out of it. So there was many times I did not feel like it, but I did the do anyway. So when I'm saying variety, when I'm saying intention, it doesn't mean like super motivation. Sometimes you got to do the things when you don't feel like it. And that was so that I could perform my regular duties that I had to do every day, fulfill my responsibilities with joy, with peace, and with steadfastness, Even, and this is the key here, when I was tired, overwhelmed, even uncertain of some things. But what I was certain of was that God was my constant, and that was the best way to get through the things, was to stay connected with Him and be willing to be challenged even when it was hard. All right? I may have had waves rocking that boat around me pretty intensely at times, but when you live out of overflow, you trust that God is at work and you follow His lead. It's a very different experience and a very different posture. When you do the work for spiritual health, you need to make sure it's absorbed, okay? We talked about variety, we talked about posture, but when you're doing these things, you want it to be absorbed. This is the intention, to make sure that change is happening. This is how your body can use it when it's needed. That's the strong foundation when the boat is rocking, right? Things have been absorbed, so it allows you to stay steady in the midst of the storm. That overflow is there so that when life is hard, you still have so much hope for what's ahead, okay? When life is challenging, you can be present in the moment with a heart of gratitude and generosity and all those good things. It is that overflow that is only present when you're absorbing the goodness of those spiritual disciplines. You see what I'm saying? The overflow is the foundation, and that's there when you're absorbing the goodness of what you're practicing. So you can quickly read scripture on your app while you're running from here to there, or you can create space to be with God and let His word and time with Him fill your spirit. Let me say it again. You can wake up and quickly, let me click the app, let me read it for 2 seconds. Okay, move on, check, I did that. Or you can make space to just say, God, I'm going to be with you because I want this word to change you. I want my mind transformed, my spirit transformed. I want to function out of spiritually like healthy emotional and mental well-being. You see what I'm saying? Talk with Him about what is on your mind. Like, be intentional about that time with God. See the difference between hurried versus intention? Look for the guidance in His word to give you what you need in that moment, all right? So, I love what I'm about to say because it really drives home this point, right? If you're not totally picking up what I'm throwing down, if you're not intentional about your spiritual disciplines and actually embracing challenge and change, it would be like for example, what I want to say to you is don't make the healthy dinner and then not eat it. Like that's kind of what it's like. Or don't go to the gym and then just not work out. Don't fill that water bottle and put it next to you and then neglect to drink it. Likewise, we don't want to pray without really seeking God's face and expecting a word. Don't read the Word of God without desiring revelation and change. Don't be in community without being intentional about giving and receiving. Don't be in service without a desire to see transformation in others and yourself. Don't even go to church to not be part of the change, because whether you're a hand or a foot or a nose, you need somebody and somebody needs you. You see the difference here? And we all need a hunger for more of God so that we can live out of that overflow. So consider singing a new song if it's been a while. And what I mean by that is draw near to Him in new ways, intentional ways. Just take the time. Faith should not be boring. It should not be monotonous or void of abundance, right? Like this is the whole idea of avoiding spiritual complacency and living out of a place of challenge, right? This is the mountaintop, avoiding the plateau. So, full circle, if you don't want to plateau with your spiritual wellness, I want to take things super, super practical for a minute, because the only way to truly know if this is happening is if there's evidence of the overflow, right? Like if there's not complacency, then you'll see growth. And so I want to share this amazing analogy that came from another podcast episode that I was listening to. So a really, really great place to start is to assess the fruit of the Spirit in your life. Okay. We talk about the fruit of the Spirit all the time, but just think they're magical, right? Love, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, all the goodness, self-control. Whew, that's a good one, right? So, how you could tell if you're avoiding spiritual complacency, just take an assessment of how strong the fruits of the Spirit are in your life. So, I was listening to this podcast episode by Tim Mackey. I'm a huge fan of him and the Bible Project work that they do, but this podcast is Exploring My Strange Bible. And this episode was all about the Spirit and its fruit, okay? And that's what we're talking about here. So, let me break it down this way. How do you know a plant is healthy, right? It's fruit, it's flowers. Like I can tell you right now, I have like this mini veggie garden I was so excited about, and certain things are growing and thriving, and other things not so much, right? Like that, I could tell how healthy that plant is if my beans are coming in, or if my broccoli's coming in, right? So, fruit of the Spirit, it's a reflection of your connection with God. It's this evidence of the overflow. And let me read Galatians 5:22 through 23 for a second, because this is the fruit of the Spirit here in front of our eyes, right? When we go there. So it says, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self control. All right. So, why this gardening analogy, or this fruit analogy? It's actually quite brilliant because do we grow the fruit? No, right? Like, we're not in charge of the sun. The soil is an essential part, but a gardener is necessary. All right. Like, I could tell you for a fact, if I don't get out and tend my mini garden, it's not going to work. So, what's the significance here? Gardening takes work. Like, being a gardener, like, ask my parents, they have this amazing, huge, beautiful garden, but it takes work. And so you've got to put in the work from a spiritual perspective to see spiritual fruit. You are the gardener. All right. There's things around us, right, that are just part of life that we're not in control over. Like I said, the sun, but we need to work at it. Okay. So what we must do is we can create an environment where fruit thrives, or we can hinder its growth, right? Like that's up to the gardener. You have to garden your life. If you haven't been, then don't be surprised that things aren't changing, right? You will do things you don't want to do if you forget to garden, or even vice versa. You'll do things you shouldn't do, right? So, why does this happen more often than we like? Like you could be doing the things and be like, man, but why is this so hard? Why am I doing the things I shouldn't do and not doing the things I should do? Check your gardening skills, right? Like part of being a gardener is strategy. Like garden needs water, so does our body. But the garden doesn't need us to dump like 75 gallons on it over the course of 10 seconds. Like it needs water consistently over time, right? We need to be strategic about it. That's part of the skill of being a gardener, right? So in our spiritual life, like we don't just dump disciplines on us like as much as we can in one period of time. Like it's staying connected to God continuously and participating intentionally in spiritual disciplines on a regular ongoing basis. What's so powerful about these analogies, and I love how God has done this, because our bodies are the exact same way. Like we need water consistently over time. Like that's how we should physically hydrate, right? Like when you're thirsty, dehydration has already snuck up on you. When my plant is wilty, the soil's already depleted. Like this dehydration analogy is phenomenal because when you're dehydrated as a person, it's like being drunk. It's that significant. Like this is us failing our gardening skills over our own bodies, right? Like when we're dehydrated, our brains find it harder to focus even. Like, and this could manifest in difficulty concentrating, slower reaction times, like an inability to think clearly. Gosh, nobody wants mental fog. And other things can complicate the process, right? Like we can start, experiencing confusion, headaches, muscle cramps, all sorts of things. It can impact our kidneys, even like goodness gracious. And so this is why it's so important to drink water throughout the day. It's an intentional way that we fuel our body. So when we are a gardener over our spiritual wellness, we need to feed ourselves intentionally throughout the day. We need to water our gardens intentionally throughout the day. Like we're being intentional about it, right? And this is just all of this. I'm going to such detail here because we need to remember that in order for us to be, produce fruit and avoid spiritual complacency, we need to be skilled gardeners over our spiritual life. We can't just get a gallon of water in once a week, like, or even once a day. It just doesn't work that way. So spiritual disciplines really are meant to be a lifestyle. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is if we go back to avoiding a spiritual plateau, like this is one of the biggest things. Like when things are a lifestyle, it's not easy. This is like saying no to pizza and cupcakes at birthday parties, and like choosing smoothies in the morning instead of, Fruit Loops. It's like being intentional. It's a lifestyle. It's not always easy, but the results are so worth it, right? So, these spiritual disciplines as a lifestyle is just making living out the fruit of the spirit less hard, right? Because you have these rhythms of doing the right thing. You're becoming a master gardener, so the fruit is just coming out, and this is how we're living out of overflow. Okay, so and to be honest, when you do this when life is easy, that muscle memory will kick in when life is hard. Like, it'll be easier to see the benefits and keep up with these disciplines when life just becomes so hard, because your spiritual muscles are there. You've been working on it. So if you're wanting that mountaintop experience, instead of just being laid out flat on that plateau, just be a good gardener. Be intentional about growth. So consider how your spiritual disciplines are challenging you to create change. Remember, challenge ignites change, plateaus extinguish progress. So now for Coach Autumn's practice of the day, because practice does not make perfect, but practice does make permanent. So today's tip for you is to go through this fruit of the Spirit. Read that Galatians verse again, and think of it kind of like an assessment, and say, like, which ones do I really like got on lock here, and which ones do I need quite a bit of work with? Be super honest with yourself, because no matter what fruit you're like, okay, maybe there's a few more here that I actually need more work on than I realize. Like, challenge yourself to be really intentional in your spiritual disciplines. Like, what are you implementing daily? Just assess your gardening skills. Okay, so this is a really vague tip, but what I'm telling you to do is to take the time, maybe in your time in the Word or with your time with God, like pray through Galatians 5 and say, okay, how am I really doing with these fruit of the Spirit? It's really just taking this assessment, this very subjective assessment, but that's why we put the Holy Spirit on it, right? We pray through it. What's working in your life? What needs change? Where are you comfortable? Where do you need to challenge yourself? Our spiritual formation connects to every other area of our life. So we really need to be intentional about this. Like, do you just feel that there's an area of your well-being that you've plateaued in generally? Because whatever area you feel like maybe you've plateaued in that relates to your well-being, your spiritual formation is connected to it. So just talk to God about it. How can you challenge yourself in new ways to create that change, get off that flat top, and get to the mountaintop? Thank you for tuning in to the Aligned Living Podcast. I'm Dr. Autumn, your guide on this journey to shalom or wholeness. Ready to embark on this journey of self-discovery and transformation? Head over to autumnswain.com to learn more and to dive deeper into the world of aligned living. Until next time, stay aligned.